I'm very happy to see you all in person for such a great event together. It's been a great pleasure to really invite all of you here at Prabhat Kitan Foundation's first in-person event after a long time. So I'm glad that all of you could make it. I'm absolutely grateful for all the presence. So let me talk about Prabhat Kitan Foundation first. Prabhat Kitan Foundation is a non-profit trust dedicated to socio-cultural welfare and humanitarian causes. In Calcutta, the foundation is dedicated to promoting literature, culture, educating, performing arts, and women empowerment. Now, all of this textbook has been great, has got great reviews and great critiques. So let us visit few of his books. Splendors of Royal Mysore, My Name is Gauhar Jan, Voice of Veena, Women of Records, and two parts of Savarkar. The latest one is A Contested Legacy, and the earlier one is Echoes from the Forgotten Past. He is also a columnist for the print. So, Vikramji has done a doctorate in history from University of Queensland, Masters of Mathematics from BITS Pilani. He has recently been elected as a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society UK as one of the Indian historians to make it. He has been awarded Sahitya Academic's first Yuva Puraskar Award in English Literature and ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York. Also received the Distinguished Alumni Award by his alma mater, BITS Pilani. He was among the 4 artists and writers in residence at the Rashtrapati Bhavan in 2015. The book Gauhar Jan was also adapted by a play by Lilith Dubey and would soon be seen as a Bollywood film by Ashutosh Gawariker. He is an Aspen Global Fellow and an Ashnover Global Fellow, former Senior Research Fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. He is currently an adjunct faculty at the Monash University, Australia. So not taking too much of your time, and let the author and our moderator speak today, I invite Mr. Vikram Sampath and Ehsaas Woman of Nagpur, Priyanka Kothari, to please come on the stage. We'll request a round of applause for our guest. Thank you. I would request all of you to please keep your phones on a vibration or a silence mode. And also would love to thank our associate partners, which are venue partners, Radisson Blue, media partners, me Lokmat, Sri Cement, and my co-colleagues, Ehsaas Woman of Nagpur, Jyoti Kapoor, myself, Parveen Tuli. We invite you all to enjoy this evening together. Thank you.
Thank you, Parveen. I saw you were almost breathless when you were saying all his accolades, and still I would just like to add he's also the founder of the Bangalore Lit Fest and Z Earth Festival. So I want to start as a devil's advocate.
Shuru mein hi.
Just finish it off so that we can have a later, it should go all smooth. But why visit history? Why revisit history, especially in the context of people? I mean, the bygones can be bygones.
Good evening, everyone, and it's always such a pleasure to be in Nagpur. I think this is my 4th visit to your wonderful city. A couple of times I'd also come here for research of my book on Savarkar. That's a very tough question to begin with. I would be out of job if you say let bygones be bygones. I make a livelihood of bygones. But jokes apart, I think it's very important because I think it was George Orwell who had said, he who controls the past controls the present, and who controls the present controls the past as well. So the importance of history in the making of a nation, in the making of a national consciousness, at both extremes. It could either be self-deprecatory consciousness, or it could be a jingoistic consciousness or just consciousness for the sake of it, and to also ensure that we don't repeat those mistakes of the past that we have committed. I think that's a very important message from history which we normally kind of neglect. So for that, it is to, I view history with that prism as to how we can revisit, relive some of the mistakes, ensure that they're not committed, and also heal what I've always held as civilizational wounds, which have unfortunately been left, unattended to.
Are we actually doing that? Are we accepting our faults or even putting it forth, and are we taking it properly?
Yes and no. I mean, there's always scope for more. The thing is, the problem, I mean, discipline like history, a very eminent historian had said, all works of history are interim reports. What people did in the past is not immutable. It is not stored in amber somewhere. And every generation looks back and, drawing from its own experience, tries to illuminate the past, present, and the future. So the very nature of the discipline is such that there needs to be a thriving of a multiplicity of opinions, multiplicity of views. There's nothing like, there is one absolute truth, but each person looks at that absolute truth through different prisms, either through biases inherently or through the availability of evidences, documents, or whatever else. So it should, the discipline should offer that space for these multiplicity of opinions, which in my view, unfortunately in India, particularly after independence, it's not happened, particularly in academic historiography, where there's been a very, very dominant, ideologically driven, what I would call a Marxist or a leftist historiography, which has dominated the narrative completely, not allowed any other alternative viewpoints to thrive. So much so that people in academia, they would lose jobs also if they towed a different line from what is considered as the mainstream. So that is very problematic, where a discipline which thrives and survives on discussion, dissent, debate, and differences of opinion, you cannot monochromatize it and make it very, very linear that way. And so that is a problem. But now I think there is slowly a mushrooming of new voices, people who are not necessarily, I mean, people like me who are not necessarily a part of the system. So we have nothing to lose. I have no job to lose from any university if I speak out my mind. And so that is why I think we can take up the gauntlet with that much more, courage and conviction.
But it might be difficult, like being so called boxed into now the rights wing intelligentsia. So kind of like you being categorized as one. Kind of like, if you're not talking their language, then it has to be the, I mean, things are polarized now. If you're not talking that, then you have to be talking the other way around. So how difficult it has been, like how difficult or how easy it is being to be a historian now?
So in fact, just yesterday, there was a tweet from Mr. Mahesh Jethmalani of the BJP who said, I watched this recent that India Today conclave with Dr. Shashi Tharoor, and he said, very nice to know that there is a right-wing historian who's come up and who presents his views so nicely and all that. And I thanked him but said, kindly don't slot me into these boxes. I am not right or left or center or anything. I am just a Bharat wing. If there is something called a Bharat wing, where I would like to tell the story of my country. How politicians use it or misuse it, they will do that anyway. So, so the idea is to not conform to these labels, because the best way to probably discredit a work is also to discredit the person who's worked on it by attaching all these labels and slanders. So let it be the way it is. You can't stop anyone from doing what they're doing. But I think it's a lot easier now. I mean, in the introduction, it was read out that I was the senior research fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library to do a research on Savarkar. That itself is an index of the changing times, where NMML, which is a repository of all the letters and documents of Savarkar, who was all the time under surveillance by Nehru's government, today offers a fellowship to somebody to work on him. So I think there are Kal Chakra, as they say, everything goes up, goes down. So neither when you're on the top, you should feel too, elated and arrogant. When you're at the trough also, everything comes up also.
So how did like a proper, a corporate package like BITS Pilani, Maths, Masters and SPJ MBA now got into a kurta clad historian?
Oh, that's why I'm sure there's no kurta.
Most of the time,
Yeah.
this morning you were, but that's totally becomes you.
Yeah. No, that again
And your
was.
journey, like how did your journey start?
I've usually held that serendipity rules my life, happy accidents. I was a boy of about 11 or 12 years of age when I'm sure some of you would remember there was this serial on television called The Sword of Tipu Sultan by Sanjay Khan, and in that the royal family of Mysore was shown in a very, very poor light, the Hindu Wadayars of Mysore, just to elevate the status of Tipu and his father Hyder Ali, who were actually usurpers of the throne of Mysore. You had to show the royal family in such a poor fashion. Those of you who remember, you'll know that the Maharaja was shown like this obese retard who was dancing along with the court dancer, and the Maharani was one of those typical, Ekta Kapoor serial vamps who was all the time conspiring for the overthrow of Tipu and all of that. And about this, there were lots of protests in different parts of Karnataka because the royal family is still held in a lot of regard and reverence for the progressive measures, the many firsts that Karnataka achieved, and what it is today was the foundational, work that the royal family did. And so to show them in this light touched a raw nerve somewhere. And as a young boy, I was just imbibing these images, and frankly, truth be told, I hated history in school for the way it was taught, and almost every history class meant kneeling down outside because I just couldn't get around to memorize who came after. Even now my knowledge of dates and so on, I need to have a chit because it just doesn't, these are very superfluous details, but that's how we are judged in the way history is taught. But then something about the serial, the protests, if you remember, there was also this talk that, there was a fire in the studio. And Sanjay Khan's face had got charred, and they were all saying that this is a curse of the Maharaja, and because he had shown him in bad light, this is bound to happen. So I really wanted to know the truth behind the false portrayal, and so completely self-motivated, more importantly self-funded initiative to keep going to Mysore from Bangalore, my hometown, every vacation along with my family. It almost became a family project with my parents, my Aji, who knew Kannada much better than I do, and though my mother is a Maharashtrian. So a lot of the meeting people from the royal family, rummaging palace archives, also old timers in Mysore.
As a teenager.
Yeah. And never with the intention that I'm going to make this into a book or it's going to become a bestseller, or all these things didn't even occur to me then. It was just with the intention that I want to find out the truth. And what eventually was just that one king and queen whom I was interested in, slowly over 10 years, even as I was doing my BITS Pilani and everything, it continued, the madness. It was some kind of a junoon, unexplainable, where I also realized it was a 600-year-long ruling house of Mysore, one of the longest reigning royal houses, the Wadayars, like maybe the Ahoms of the northeast. And I also realized that at the end of all this, that there was not a single book in modern times which covered this entire, story. Another problem which I recently pointed out of the historiography of India, which is so very Delhi-centric. Some, obscure dynasty which just ruled for 20, 30 years, but because they were in Delhi, they would get incommensurate kind of attention, whereas vast swathes of India, whether it's southern India, northeast India, parts of western India, Kashmir, all these don't feature in the narrative of what Indian history actually means. So that's when some people, advise me that you've collected so much, so why don't you put all this together in the form of a book? And that's how my first book, Splendors of Royal Mysore, the untold story of the Wadayars, it was untold because no one had told it so far, that came about. And I was still holding a corporate job then, and most often in these appraisal review meetings, my manager just couldn't understand. He said, "You're so good at your job. Why do you waste your time? You can climb the corporate ladder. You'll be." I said, "I'm not interested in it. I'm very honestly and shamelessly just doing it for the money right now. The minute I can get something out of my books and I can feel confident enough to throw it away, this will be the first thing that I'll get rid of." And luckily for me, I've been very lucky that destiny, God, or whatever you put it as, gave me this opportunity, especially after the second book, which went on to do very well, much more than what I expected it to. That it gave me the confidence that I could, make a living out of just being a writer and not having to juggle in a job where every day it would be so soul sapping, seeing those Excel sheets and doing profit and loss statements of some American company and just thinking, is this all my life is going to be all about? Can I do something better? And every morning would literally be like how children are forced to go, in kindergarten to school. Their mothers push them out of the house. It was as bad with, do I really need to do this? So I'm so glad that destiny made its way in such a way that I can do what I'm truly passionate about.
Only very few people are so lucky. So is it during this Mysore visits that you discovered Gohar Jan?
Yeah, again, serendipity. That's the constant theme all the time. So while researching on Mysore, I came across this very, very fascinating character in one of the box files there on the visiting, palace musicians to Mysore. And among so many others, there was somehow this one name that caught my eye because it said Gohar Jan, the first, gramophone celebrity of India, the first dancing girl. That's what they called her as, who was not only the entire subcontinent, she was the first artist to commercially record her voice in 1902 when recording technology came to India from London. And I saw there were just 4 or 5 pages about that box file, and she came from Calcutta, but then she had died in penury, in obscurity, and total anonymity in Mysore. There were letters that she had written to the Maharaja's government, literally pleading, please increase my salary, don't cut income tax and all of that. And in typical official Babudam, rejected, were put all over her, those letters. And there were also, hospital bills and all kinds of things which she had left unpaid, for which she was being harassed. Even after her death, some of her folks were being asked to pay up. So somehow, I don't know what was in that thing, that whole story. I said her story deserves to be told. And I didn't know how, literally, because she was a Tawaif who obviously did not have any legal heirs or any students or anything. It was so literally, searching for a needle in a haystack. I chased her for the next 4 years of my life across the length and breadth of India, from Azamgarh, where she was born, to Banaras, to Rampur, Darbhanga, Mysore, Bombay, Chennai, Calcutta, where she lived, all places that formed an important part of her life. She was actually born she was half Indian. Yeah, she was Armenian. She had a British grandfather, a Hindu grandmother, an Armenian Christian father, and she was actually born and baptized at the Holy Trinity Church in Allahabad. And later her mother and she move away to Banaras and they convert to Islam. Her mother becomes another famous Tawaif called Badi Malka Jan, and she's Gohar Jan. And then with Wajid Ali Shah's migration from Awadh to Matia Buruj outside Calcutta, all these artists and writers and everyone, they also gravitate around Calcutta, and that's how she and her mother become court musicians of Wajid Ali Shah. And and a fashion, diva, page 3 sensation of her times, someone who would ride 6-horse driven buggies, white, stallions in the thoroughfares of Calcutta. And, and this was brought about by recording technology. And interestingly, for all the women here and for the Ehsas women, when recording technology came to India, actually all the men folk, they stayed away from it. It was women across India who actually embraced this, gave up all their, hats off to all of you for leading the way. And there was so many superstitions and suspicions that, if you record into that evil English instrument, you lose your voice and the gods will be displeased and all of that.
But it was actually prior the new
the
old one was like you actually had to howl in that thing.
Correct. Yeah, in fact, you're absolutely right. That was called the acoustic era, where there were no microphones to amplify your voice. So there would be a big horn on the wall, and the artist would have to crane his or her head into it and shout as loudly as possible, and sing rather. So in a very, very high pitched voice. And depending on how loudly you screamed out, there would be a stylus at the other end which would vibrate and cut etches on a shellac master. And Indian musicians, while they're singing, they tend to move their hands and heads. So, and that would spoil the quality of the acoustic energy going into. So there would be two agents who would hold your hands, one who would hold your head and push you into that horn, saying, bellow hard. So and the other logistic problem that these records were only of 3 minutes duration. So something as expansive.
I mean, 3 minutes of howling.
Shouting, literally. And in 3 minutes, something which is as expansive as Indian classical music, where one rag can be elaborated all through the night, to be doing that like Pressy writing in literature, compress everything, little bit of improvisation, little bit of composition, taan, sargam, all of that in a capsule. Gohar Jan made that formula, which later several other women, Janki Bai of Allahabad, Zohra Bai Agrewali, Malka Jan of Agra, Bai Sundra Bai of Pune, Achan Bai of Bombay, and in the south you had Devdasis like Bangalore Nagaratnamma, Salem Godavari, Coimbatore Thai, Noti Binodini in Calcutta. So many of these, almost 85% of the early catalogues of the first 1.5 decades of recording were of women, and the men stayed conspicuously out of it, barring one or two exceptions like, say, Ustad Abdul Karim Khan and others, Barkatullah Khan on the sitar. In the south, a couple of them, Veene Sheshanna and so on. But most of the other Ustads and Pandits stayed away. But later on, they saw what recording brought to these women's lives. Like I was saying, Gohar was this flamboyant woman who would go on her horse rides across the thoroughfares of Calcutta.
And throw a party for a cat.
Yeah, when her cat gave birth to kittens.
She spent, I think, 50 grands on a party, like 10.
And so why the story is that when she was going on these joy rides, once her cavalcade is crossed by the governor of Bengal, and then he looking at her, I mean, since she was Anglo, I think her features were also fair, and she had these goggles and all that, and she was with all her regal finery and jewelry and all that. He thought she was the queen of some riyasat and actually doffed his hat. She also acknowledged him and drove away. And much later he realized that she was a common tawaif, and so he was summoned to the palace and asked to pay a fine. And the story goes that she was actually paying a fine of 1,000 rupees every day or something, but still continuing to go on those joy rides. Because for every one recording session, she would charge 3,000, 5,000 rupees. And in her lifetime, she cut close to 600 records in about 15 Indian and foreign languages, including Arabic and English. My love is a little bird that hops from tree to tree, or something very suggestive, lines like that. So she would do that. And also it's said that once Gandhiji had invited her to perform for the Congress party and help it raise funds. Quite ironically, the same man who, when several of the other, tawaifs actually said, we have lost our livelihoods, we'd like to work for the nationalist cause, it was turned down as an obscene proposal. So there are lots of standards of morality apparently. But then she was a page 3 diva, someone who would bring the money, so she was asked to do this, and she agreed, but with a condition that Gandhiji should come and attend the concert. Now he was a little amused by this lady who was actually putting up preconditions for her participation, but he agreed. But I think something kept him away, but very diligently he'd sent Maulana Shaukat Ali to represent him. Now the concert was a runaway success. They had collected some 24,000 or something by the sale of tickets. There was a stampede outside, all this happening. And later when Shaukat Ali went to collect the money, she gave him only 12,000. And when she asked the reason, she said, apparently, that go and tell your Mahatma that he talks of honesty and sincerity. He's not kept his word given to a simple Tawayaf, and by not coming himself and sending you, he's kept only half his promise, so I will also give you only half the money. So this was the chutzpah that people could have to give it back from Viceroy to Gandhiji, to some Datya ka Maharaja. When he asked her to come, she said, Datya is too below my dignity to come. You know, it's some small princely state, I cannot. And so she tried to up her game by being very pricey. And she said, I can come only if you book an entire train for me. And the man actually is supposed to have done it. So she had an entire train with 111 people going with her horses and khansamas and her tabalchi, bawarchi, everybody going in this train to Datya, which was, for someone like this, a woman with this great, obviously fiscal management didn't come anywhere near all this flamboyance that I'm talking about, and the common narrative of a Tawayef's tale, like we've seen in Umrao Jan, so all the wrong men that she gave away her heart to, who kind of ruined her. And she was reduced to the state of beggary, literally selling her compositions for ₹1 each and so on. And that's when the Maharaja of Mysore invited her as a state musician for a petty amount of 500 rupees per month, which would have been such a huge fall from grace for someone who was who's throwing parties like this. So that was the, from the place of her death in Mysore. This was how I managed to somehow, trace her across India, even outside, in Berlin, because the recording agent who came to record her was a German called Frederick William Gaisberg. So I'd gone to Berlin to actually collect. I met his family. There was a diary of Gaisberg where he recounted how she used to come to the studio decked in all her finery, and every day there would be a new dress. There would never be a repetition of either the dress or the jewelry, and how she bargained very nicely for a higher sum, which he was very happy to give. And so that information from Gaisberg. And in London also I had gone, where I got the first, these Tawayefs were also very proficient in those 64 arts, as they would say, of which literature and poetry was something very unique too. They were all largely literate women, while women from so-called respected houses were probably in ghongats inside, whereas these women were actually writing poetry, writing books. They were the Devdasis of the South were the first women taxpayers of this country. So Badi Malka Jan had written this entire corpus of Urdu ghazals called Makhzan-e-Ulfat-e Malika, or the treasure trove of Malka's love. And the only copy, I searched for that book all over, in Rampur, in Ali Baksh Museum, or in Patna, all these places. But it was found, the only copy was found in London, where it was luckily there. Everything of ours is at least there, while we may rue that they've taken it away. I'm sure if it was left to us, we would have made mincemeat out of it. So the copy was there. So it was literally like putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle to reconstruct the story of this fascinating woman, and also as a musician myself, to understand her voice and how it sounded, because those 78 RPMs, the shellac discs, they don't even come now, and you don't have the machine, the needle that goes around. So that became another trail in itself, where I collected a lot of records, and that led to another serendipity in my life of establishing probably India's first online digital sound archive, called the Archive of Indian Music. So
that's a very ingenious website. Every lover, or even if you don't like music, you should visit it. It has from all. It's not like only all through India you have all these folk, even folk and classical and pieces.
It's on SoundCloud. On SoundCloud, if you actually type Archive of Indian Music, so we actually restored about 15,000 of these records from Chor Bazaars and Raddiwalas, which is where the valuable cultural inheritance of this country lies rotting. And you know, again, a fellowship to Berlin. I made a lot of visits to the archives across Europe, in Vienna, Paris, London, Berlin. And it astounded me to see that almost all of them had one concept of a national sound archive. The second is they also had valuable holdings of Indian recordings, not only of music, but also voices of common Indians. For instance, there was this archive in Berlin called the Laut Archive. It had voices of the prisoners of war of the First World War of Indian origin, about 200 such recordings. And Germans being Germans, for every 3-minute recording, there is a 40-page documentation saying who is this fellow, you know. And he was just asked to say some chutkula sunao, some episode you'd say. And the documentation was, what is this story? It is written down in the native script of that, you know, Punjabi, Pushto, Tamil, Sindhi, Bengali, all kinds of languages. And who is this fellow? Which village he came from? What was his father's name? Which school he studied? All these details were meticulously captured. And people there constantly ask me, doesn't India have a national sound archive? And you know, as a student of history and a student of music and as an Indian, I think I was deeply embarrassed that we don't have one such. So in coming back, in 2011 was when we started this completely as a private, public charitable trust, helped with the generous funding of Mr. T.V. Mohandas Pai, who was then with Infosys. Later on, Mrs. Sudha Murthy and others also chipped in. So we've got this, and so digitizing this all the time, including the first ever recording of the national anthem when it was not yet the national anthem, Jana Gan Man, by the Vishwa Bharati Chorus in 1911, the first recording of Vande Mataram in Rabindranath Tagore's voice, a recording of Gandhi's speech, the only recording he made on the gramophone. He gave radio broadcasts, but on the gramophone he gave, when he went to the round table conference, it's called The Spiritual Message of Gandhi, where he talks about what he thinks of God and its conception and all that. And so that, recording, the first recording of M.S. Subbulakshmi as a 9-year-old child, in a shrieky, shrill kind of a voice. All of this I found in Chor Bazaars, in Chandni Chowk in Delhi, or Moor Market in Madras and places like this. And it's so sad that these are just allowed to rot, and that is the regard and reverence we have for our past as a nation, and that's really, really, really sad.
But thanks to you, no more they are rotting. So before we go to the sum and summation, the book, I would like to know, or maybe you can't answer this specific question, that what the heck were we doing in those history classes? Like reading those or mugging those cherry-picked dates and invasions, and these people having, I think these writers had some kind of selective amnesia. I mean, once you start reading your books, I realized that, we could have used that time much better. So what, I mean, when are we expecting this data in the history books? I mean, you can channelize it more than anybody else.
Right question to the wrong person. I
But who
unfortunately
else?
hold no influence or power in government
But
or
you
anybody.
should try and at least get into the board and get these corrections done. But are these gatekeepers are still holding so solid that after 60 years also, he just like V. Savarkar and Bhagat Singh, they are just like flash in a pan kind of names here and there scattered. And like you said, like I've been brought up in Assam and Orissa and all that. So I knew these people, these dynasties. I was aware of them, but I always thought probably they weren't as great as the Mughal Empire or something. And later we come to know that Ahom was the only dynasty which could stop the Mughal from coming. They only were the ones who did not get usurped. So are these gatekeepers still so strong? I mean, not letting go to the children. I mean, they are not changing any politics or doing any.
Possibly because recently after that session again, a lot of negative backlash came to me, especially on social media, challenging, saying I was making motivated and false statements, etc. It's there for everybody to go. And the NCRT website has class 6, 7 and 8, which ancient, medieval and modern Indian history. Books are available free of cost to download. So I would urge everybody to go and just download
Most
a
of
copy,
us are-
and you will be horrified to see what you see there. For instance, the Cholan Empire, the Cholas were the ones who established our suzerainty in Southeast Asia and such a civilizational outreach. They get one paragraph or one page. Where in Maharashtra, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj gets only a photograph, and no description of who he was or what he did. The caption to that photograph is all that a student learns today about Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. So I forgive all the other, lapses. And the Peshwas get, I think, one page. Vijayanagar Empire. The Vijayanagar Empire, for all its glory, gets
One
less than a
chapter.
page.
Yeah,
And that too in the context that Hampi was a great place, and apparently it just fell by itself in 1565. I don't know how, but and then but we are told that Mahmud of Ghazni was a great patron of the arts. He wanted to really understand the country he was conquering, though he never conquered India. He just came, looted, went back, looted, went back. Every time he wanted money back home, he would come here. He never conquered us. But then he apparently was such a patron, and he wanted to understand the country he conquered, and so he left behind Al-Biruni to write a book on us and so on. And these people gave us the whole sense of a nation. In all of Sanskrit literature, there is not a single verse apparently in praise of the motherland. It was the first time, I think, in 13th century when Amir Khusro, first in Persian, gave us the idea that we need to be very, eulogizing of our motherland. So this is the kind of nonsense that a young person grows up. I'm sure many of you here have seen it in your children's textbooks. I don't want to.
Even our textbooks were more
was still
about
better.
inversion. It was like more like, we were only getting invaded most of the
Long
time.
story of only battles we lost, and again a thin line between chest thumping and Mera Bharat Mahan, and we in the ancient time we had discovered everything from nuclear bombs, and that's another extreme of looniness. But the other thing that we just kept losing to everyone. Today, if we are alive as and around as one of the oldest living civilizations, there must have been some battles we won also, and some resistance that we put. So where are those stories? Where are those heroes? And in fact, that's my next book, which is a collection of about 18 such people from across India and across timelines and various dynasties and so on, who put up this resistance. How many of us know about Lalitaditya Muktapida of the Karkota dynasty of Kashmir, who was the one who ensured that the Arabs just could not enter India beyond the invasion of Sindh? There was a lady called Rani Naiki Devi in Gujarat, a woman regent queen who defeated Muhammad Ghori. And after that, Ghori never managed to look back at Gujarat. And in my own home state, Karnataka, we had Rani Abbakka, of Chautha, who defeated the Portuguese. And in neighboring Kerala, there was Marthanda Varma, who defeated the Dutch East India Company to such an extent that the Dutch, globally, they, diminished as a global power after that defeat. Now, these heroes, we need to put their statues all over and have roads named after them, celebrate them. Instead, we have Lodhi Road, Khilji Road, this road. Of course, the other extreme of going in, blackening it, having violence about it. That's not this one. But look at the subconscious way in which we have just imbibed this defeatist mentality that, oh, we are destined to lose. We are a loser country. They came and gave us everything. So many educated Indians, very nicely we speak that maybe the British, colonialism was a good thing. They gave us the idea of English education and railways and civil services and modernism. They defined the contours of a country, not realizing the civilizational, nation that we've always been, right in the way we do our, pujas from millennia when we talk of Bharatavarsha, Bharatakhanda and Jambudvipa and all of that. We are marking out that sacred geography in our minds, in our conscious memories for the longest period of time. Political boundaries of no country have been the same for millennia. So also with India, it's been a constant work in progress. But to deny that and to actually, as such a matter of fact, we don't even question that, right? So I think that problem exists in the way we look at our past, and that is why your first question is valid as to why we cannot let bygones remain bygones. Because if that happens, then how is it that a young person will feel any sense of ownership to this country or its destiny? You're looking at someone else's nation, and that too a nation which just lost. And anyway, so even things like Aryan invasion theory, etc., which are invented by the colonialists to tell us that, you know, your destiny has been to be invaded by outside people right from that time. We coming is just the last, in the nail in the coffin. So you need to accept it as your destiny. So now archaeological as well as genetic evidences, Rakhi Ghadi, you had the excavations, have totally debunked the whole invasion myth. There's still some talk on migration. But then we still go on with these things, and I don't know how long it will take and who will have to go and shake things up to actually make the bureaucracy and the governments of this country wake up and smell the coffee.
Also, like even the freedom movement, has that been made like, you know, to give us a very unique identity, like, you know, bina khadak bina dhal humne freedom paa liya, and these revolutionaries had
Yeah.
nothing to do, to just, like, you know, maybe we don't set
Yeah.
a bad example to the kids, or what?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I think in a Delhi University textbook by Bipin Chandra and Mridula Mukherjee, they had the definition for Bhagat Singh, Surja Sen, Jatin Das, revolutionaries were revolutionary terrorist, you know, and their terrorist acts, killing of Saunders was a terrorist act. So when a young person who is also looking at the news and the newspapers and seeing terrorists in action in Kashmir, in Afghanistan, all this Burhan Wani and Kasab, and then Bhagat Singh is also equated in the same, you know, definition. What sort of impact would that have on his mind? So that is the very subtle manner in which you play on young minds and ensure obliteration. You don't have to do much. You ask anyone as they grow up, and this is also the books that the UPSC recommend for reading. So the terminologies are very important. So that was true where we've been almost always told that it was a very easy, simple, linear narrative due to which we got freedom. One after the other, they were non-violent movements. But then the converse is actually true, where all the time from the 1857 uprising, which in fact Savarkar called the first war of Indian independence, till 1946 with the naval mutiny in Bombay, which is what got India her freedom. The heroics of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, the INA, and the naval mutiny, which literally shook the British foundations. That stream is never spoken about. So both my books are not only just the story of Savarkar, which it is, but along with that there is this parallel narrative of Indian freedom struggle which has been so willfully and maliciously suppressed for very, very obvious political reasons. And I think that is now dying to reclaim itself, to be spoken back. At least 75 years have passed. So can we talk about those from Maharashtra, the revolutionary movement, which I trace, whether it was Vasudev Balwant Phadke or the Chafekar Bandhus, and then Savarkar himself, and people who worked with him in London for the freedom struggle, Shamji Krishnavarma, Madam Bhikaji Kama, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madanlal Dhingra, Lala Hardayal, MPT Acharya, VVS Iyer. These are names you ask any young person, nobody would even have any recollection, Prafulla Chaki, Khudiram Bose, Aurobindo Ghosh, Barin Ghosh there, Sachindranath Sanyal, Rash Bihari Bose, the whole, of course, Bhagat Singh has been eulogized thanks to popular media, cinema, Sukhdev, Rajguru, all of them.
Because he was martyred. I'm sorry, I'm interjecting, but was it like, because if you're a martyr, then probably
There were so many other martyrs, we don't even care
Azad,
much.
but Azad and Bhagat Singh.
Azad also, I don't know, is there any popular...
But people still recognize Chandrasekhar.
But how much do we know? We probably just know their name. We
Yeah.
don't even know
Yeah.
much about
Yeah, of course.
what they did and so on. So I think that's a very sad state where in the course of this, when I went to Port Blair, to the cellular jail, and actually, you can never relive what they lived, the kind of tortures that these revolutionaries faced there. It was only the revolutionaries who were sent to Port Blair. Not any of the other, not even one Congress leader was ever sent to Port Blair. It was only these people who did not even have the basic human rights, human facilities, forget rights, of good food or toilet or, medical facilities, where all day they were going on that Kolhuka Bell punishment, oil grinding mill, in the hot blazing heat of Port Blair to extract 30 pounds of oil. And if you didn't do that at the end of the day, you would be whiplashed. And the food you got was full of insects and reptiles and all that, and most of them, after eating that, they would end up with diarrhea. But then, I'm sorry to say this like this, but then they went through it. All we can do is just hear it. But since there were fixed timings to go to the toilet, you were not allowed, if you had diarrhea, to go when you wanted, and so most of the prisoners would defecate in their cells, and sitting, eating, sleeping amidst your own squalor. And the kind of soul-numbing experience that could have been to break their backs. People like Savarkar would not get paper and pen to write letters to your daughter and all those things, but they would actually have a charcoal, or through your nails they would inscribe poems on the walls of the cell, and to spite him, the jailer Barry would come and whitewash the walls. And little did he know that this man had such a precocious memory that he had memorized all the poems and 6,000 verses of Marathi poetry, Kamala, Saptarashi and all of that, which he wrote there in cellular jail. Those things were still available for publication. And he was put in solitary confinement for 6 months, 8 months. His cell opened out to the gallows. So the only human contact you had were human beings screaming and shouting to be taken away to their death. So these kind of tortures that people faced, almost 500 odd, prisoners who were there, political prisoners, largely from Bengal, many from Punjab, a few from Maharashtra, and other states. There's a plaque there which has all their names, and I was standing in front of it for several minutes and being deeply moved by reading every name. It's just a name there, but it's a life, it's a family behind each of those names, the sacrifices behind each of that name. And we, as an ungrateful nation, we forget even remembering their names. We sitting in air-conditioned rooms today and Twitter, 240 characters, we pass certificate, he was a traitor, he was a patriot. How ungrateful can we be as a nation? And that's why I don't think we are progressing. So I think the reason is, the imperative need is we reclaim these stories and give them, the least we can do is to give them that sense of respect and, the dignity that they deserve.
Yeah, because when I was reading your book, I was like, this is Auschwitz happening, or even worse happening. And you see all through Germany, you have these museums of Holocaust, and there's so much literature around Holocaust, but nothing about cellular jail as if it didn't exist. It only was like Kala Pani was like something very dreadful, but not as you would know, so dreadful as it is. So coming...
In fact, yesterday, BBC had done some article about this new controversy about Savarkar and petition and this and that, and then they asked me for opinions which I refused to give them, but then they put it out, I think an article quoting, I think from my book, etc. And my tweet to them publicly was, the question that BBC needs to ask is not whether who wrote petitions or not. They need to ask their former rulers as to why did they create a hellhole like cellular jail in the first place. Will they be honest enough to seek an apology for that, for the human rights violation that they did? And can that truth be told to British children today? Where they understand what was done and why it should never happen again. And that's the role of history, it's not vengeance stories, revenge, rage, anger. That's not the thing. I think it's a issue of revisiting it to ensure that these mistakes are never repeated again.
Definitely. I think they should get the message correct, finally maybe. So I want to come to Veer Savarkar. Like he was such a complex character. Like He was an erudite, but a revolutionary. He was a thinker, but a leader. He was a poet, and yet he did have that to form the Hindu Mahasabha secretly. So, but still he was a political orphan, to say. Nobody still wants to own him. Then also, or probably now. Why did you choose Savarkar, and what is the legacy that you want to contest for him?
Why Savarkar? So the thing is, why not Savarkar? Because someone like him, who I think, all of us know the way he interferes our lives even today. Yeah, till yesterday, I don't even have to make a point, because till yesterday, all the news channels were abuzz only with interviews, what the defense minister said. There's so much of dissection. Then someone from the Congress will say something else, and someone from here will say something else, and then there are defamation suits, election rallies he's invoked. Election manifestos go on in Maharashtra whether Bharat Ratna should be given to him or not, and things like that. But
Award should be named after him.
whatever else. I mean, so much of controversy. But some young person like our dear friend Chaitanya, who's sitting here, if he wants to know what is this noise about, who is this man, because his history textbook will not even mention his name, what is the book that he will fall back on? There is nothing written. The last comprehensive biography of his was done in the 60s when he was still alive by Dhananjay Keer. Of course, in Marathi there are lots of books, but I'm talking for a pan-Indian reader, there would be nothing. And so a person who is so relevant, whose ideology, Hindutva, is so relevant today in India, considering it's in political ascendancy everywhere, and someone who is either raised to the skies or demonized, there is an alarming lack of scholarly work or scholarly academic intervention in his life, and everybody is quick to pass judgments either for him or against him. And I think that is the something that really riled me, saying you may love to hate him, you may love to love him, but let either of it be actually based on informed love or informed hatred, and not on preconceived ideas. So after many people have also told me that you have not given your verdict on the person. I said that is not my goal. A historian is not a judge, jury, prosecutioner. He's somebody who just illuminates the records, illuminates the archives, and brings it to a discerning public. Now, in the first volume, I have put all the 8 petitions that Savarkar filed as is. So you people can read it. I have, of course, expressed my opinion about what I think of this one. After reading it, if someone still thinks he's a apologist, he's a traitor, I mean, that's perfectly your justified viewpoint. But without knowing that, to do it based on some, social media forwards and Twitter, some curiously cropped, version, that is, I think, wrong. So let all of it be available in public realm, and it's left to the discerning readers to make up their mind. I think that's how I would view history. Particularly, you asked about his contested legacy and why it is. So someone, he was far ahead of his times, I think, and that was his problem in his lifetime and also now, where in the of course, in his childhood in Nashik, where from then on, talking about Western philosophies that he was reading along with Indian scriptures and all of that, and also someone who formed the first organized secret society of India, the Mitra Mela, which later became Abhinav Bharat, the first ever student bonfire he made in Pune in 1905 against the partition of Bengal, and then the 13 years that he was held in captivity in Ratnagiri. The kind of social reforms that he undertook there was stellar in nature. I mean, the first intercaste dining cafe in India coming up in Ratnagiri, at a time when even among the Maharashtrian Brahmins, maybe the Deshasthas and the Konkanasthas would not sit together and eat. To have a place where everyone, Sahibhojan became such an important feature of all his programs. The first temple, the Patit Pavan Mandir, where people of all communities could go and worship. Intercaste marriage, availability of the Vedic literature to all communities and not just the preserve of just the Brahmins, and he being a Chitpavan Brahmin himself, doing all of this. Obviously, it was something that was shaking up society a lot. So he made more enemies than friends, because I think we are an orthodox and a slow to change society. Things have to be done dhire dhire in piecemeal. This thing, you can't shake things up. So I think he made more enemies than friends, and so radical views which would not get acceptance, including his own party, he could not hold together as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha. And I pointed out these as his character flaws, his flaws of leadership, where there was a Savarkar faction, there was a Shama Prasad Mukherjee faction, there were people from North India who had their faction, and eventually the Hindu Mahasabha collapsed as a political entity. But then a rationalist who did not believe, an anti-ritual, so much so that his own, wife's Shraddh, he did not want to have it performed, or his own Shraddh, he did not, made a will that you should not do that, completely against rituals and superstitions and all of that, did not consider the cow as being worthy of worship, something that will cause heckles even today. Imagine what it would have in 1920s. So things like this, but as you said, a very, very sensitive poet who was also a fiery revolutionary, a man of contrasting contradictions. And what am I talking about Savarkar to a Maharashtrian audience? It's like Suraj ko Deepak dikhana. But then this is the beauty of the man who has probably been very popular in Maharashtra, but outside, thanks to the political campaign, of course, and also he wrote so profusely in Marathi, being a poet, a playwright, a dramatist, historian, a journalist, a narrator. So all his works, the Savarkar Samagra Vangmay in Marathi, 10 volumes that are there, were really not accessed by mainstream historians. And so a very warped view of his legacy, of his life, created to suit political expediency. I think that has been the bane. And this is a small way to probably bring that thing out for public scrutiny again.
It was a legacy, I think. Probably was decades early, not even years. So because the Shuddhi movement and all are so relevant now. Like you said that you have pointed out his flaws. So both your biographies have been so objective. How did you maintain that? Like, were you all writing all the, because I was like in the middle of the book and I was like, I mean, people like Yashpal has been given Padma Shri and he's been called a British stooge. So I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but but I mean, you feel angry because parallelly you know that somewhere the freedom struggle was lost and the power play was the politics power play was already on. So how can, but your thing is very, very objective. How did you maintain that objectivity?
That's a good question. It's a biographer's conundrum and responsibility, according to me, because I've usually likened biography to falling in love. It's like a love affair. You fall in love with your character, like I did with Gohar Jan, and literally you then, like it happens in love, you probably chase your love interest. You go through every little detail of the person, and midway either you can get disillusioned with the person and drop it, or you continue with it. And in the process, you get to know so much about your protagonist, much more than probably the protagonist himself or herself knows about their life, because you have a 360-degree view of their life. You have their enemies become your enemies, their friends are your friends. You start becoming almost subconsciously, you become like their lawyers. But while writing, that's the responsibility that is called upon. Saying cut off those emotional cords and become a bystander. Suddenly you're called upon to be neutral, because if you don't do that, then the thin line between a biography and a hagiography, where you are just extolling the person and trying to whitewash all their flaws, I think that becomes this thing. So a biographer needs to be conscious of this, that while you're doing it only because you like the person, sometimes you may also do it to demonize the person also, but nonetheless, as objective as you can be, that needs to be your touchstone, and be honest to the evidences that show up in your research, and present it as is. So many places have been so critical of him, or critical evidences about him. I've put it up, for people to assess and evaluate, so that it's not And I may find it critical, someone else may find it actually something necessary in his time to do. So it's left again to the discerning reader to make up their mind.
So you did consider your readers intelligent enough.
Of course.
So the last question, she's been showing me the cards for so long, and I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions for you. But you have a picture of Sonia Gandhi presenting the Gohar Jan and with Gohar, I mean unveiling Gohar Jan, and you have Modi ji unveiling Savarkar. And your appendices and your bibliographies.
We have one today with Mohan Bhagwat ji.
One. So, and your bibliography and appendices, they run through hundreds of pages, like hotel bills and whatnot. So, I think this, and then you gave 4 years to Gohar Jan, you gave 5 years to him. So this can be pretty overwhelming for a new or a young historian. So what's your message to them? Probably they might be like 1100 pages. Like, is it possible? Like, you have to match up to him to be really renowned in India.
No, it's not that way. And we think who's going to read? We have this young boy here, Chaitanya,
No, it's so readable.
Who's read it. And I had another, on Twitter, there was this boy called 12-year-old Shashwat Pandey, who's read the book and he's put a video review of the book. And it was so heartening to know, and all that effort then feels, worth all the effort, that these stories are coming out, and if it's made available to people, I think people will take
But the amount of groundwork, I don't think people who haven't read the book would know that. I mean, they must be knowing what you're talking about on YouTube, but unless you touch this book, you won't know the amount of groundwork that you have gone through.
And
so it can be, but is it, I mean, at least that's why probably we are convinced, because we are still not right-left people. So we are still in the stage where we can get convinced. So probably those proofs convince us to the facts that you have placed here.
Yeah. So everything, there's a reference. There's a
Are they easily available in India or
no? That's a good question. And since we're in Nagpur, I should mention that, while writing about those chapters about Gandhi's murder and its aftermath, this very, very forgotten chapter of the massacre of Maharashtrian Brahmins was something that it's probably spoken in hushed tones or in Marathi maybe.
For me. That was news when I read 1948.
Yeah. Maybe in Marathi books people have written it. There are many novels and all which I have quoted where people have spoken, but in English and for a national audience, people didn't know that like the anti-Sikh riots you had, carnage of Brahmins in Maharashtra, in Nagpur, in Pune, Mumbai, Satara, the Sangli, the Patwardhan princely states, Kolhapur, where even Bhalji Pendarkar's studio was gutted, and almost 25,000 RSS workers, even children and women put behind bars for about 8 months with children. Just because it was assumed that the assassins were at some point of time a member of this organization. 6 months, 8 months, people rotting in jail with no cognizable offense or registered crime. And this massacre itself would not even have been known to people, but for a few foreign scholars, this lady called Maureen Patterson, who came in the 50s to Maharashtra to investigate that, and she said in those days the property losses were in the range of 5 to 10 crores, which she says is a gross underestimate. The number of lives lost from 1,000 to 5,000 we wouldn't even know, because FIRs were not lodged, cases were not registered. And the worst part was, even now when I, during the research, I put it out on social media saying, if you have family stories, please reach out to me. And I was deluged with emails. So many people with heart-wrenching stories of their grandparents or their great-grandparents, how their properties were destroyed. Entire villages were ethnically cleansed of the Brahmin community, most of them migrating only to Bombay or Pune and so on. And these stories came out. Then I asked permission from them, saying, can I include this in my book? Because I think history is again that tool which allows the space to put out these and heal the wounds, my favorite theme all the time. But then many of them said, you can use the story, but we are very scared to put out our names. So in the appendix you have first person victim accounts. Majority of it is anonymous, because they say even after so many years, 70 plus years, people who led the mobs or people who did what they did are in positions of power in Maharashtra today, and we would not want to ruffle feathers. So if it is that kind of fear in which you live even now, then I think it speaks a lot about how we are as a society, and we can't even forget justice. Justice is a far, cry, but even acknowledgement for the torture you face and to rubbish it away. Oh, that is just some Sanghi myth and all these kind of things that keep getting told. So those victims and their lives, and there again, if the state had woken up and maybe had made a very strict policy that when a political assassination happens of a major national leader, what should be the measures taken against the community of the assassin, 1984 might not have repeated. So this was a trailer, and we found the horror film unfolding in 1984. 48 and 84, very curiously interchanged digits. So these, I think, are the stories. So it's a combination of many things: archival work, oral histories, translations, which is what a historian needs
so
to.
So much for the non-violence. I mean, this happens after Gandhi's assassination, and Gandhians would have done it. I don't know how.
The saddest part, Priyanka ji, is that in 1926, when in Delhi, you had the Arya Samaj leader, Swami Shraddhanand, who was actually murdered in broad daylight by this man called Abdul Rashid, the fanatic. Gandhiji says, my dear brother Abdul Rashid, I do not consider him as an assassin. You need to get into the psyche of the assassin to understand why he picked up the gun. The onus of introspection is on the Hindu community, not on this thing. We should understand what caused the angst, for the other person to pick the gun, and that caused a lot of consternation. And obviously, and Savarkar also wrote so many pieces in Shraddhanand against it. The tragic, the irony was 20 years later, the same man who kind of justified it gets assassinated, and his followers, who are fed all their life with non-violence, don't stop and think, can we get into the psyche of my dear brother Godse and try to find out why he picked up the gun? That they did not do. Instead, forget Godse was anyway caught and executed, and probably rightly so, for the crime that he committed. But his community, what did thousands and thousands of other Maharashtrian Brahmins have to do with this crime, and why did they have to pay the price for this? So that is the whole irony of this country, its historical narrative which is fed to us of ahimsa and so on. It didn't make an impact on anybody, and these mobs were led by congressmen, and that is accounted in so many congressmen's memoirs, as I quote in the book. Dwarka Prasad Mishra, who is a minister of the central provinces here in Nagpur, Berar and so on. He writes that most of the mob leaders were office bearers of various Congress committees and so on, and he got a lot of pressure from politicians that these people should be let out, that they would take the matter up to the central home minister Patel to ensure that these people get out and all of that. So it's sad that this is the irony of our times. This is to me like a Shakespearean tragedy, from Swami Shraddhanand to Gandhi, and how their murderers were dealt with by the people. So I think that's a sad story.
And never told. I mean, at least I never heard it before I read it in the book. I know I can go. I have a lot of questions, but still, I would like to open the floor for.
If any of you guys have a question, please raise your hands. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, maybe this is not your domain to answer this question, but like, since history and education are very closely linked, uh, have you been approached by the government yet, or have you put forward any suggestions for the national education policy or anything of that sort, that how to change and how to get out of the Marxist and the leftist clique and the hold that they have, like people like Rumila Thapar and Irfan Habib, which we saw, like they are like, I don't know, I can't even use the words, but yeah.
No, I have not been asked anything about the history textbooks and so on. But then, yeah, the government did reach out to me for inputs on the new education policy.
Yeah.
That was way back, but that was on something totally different. That whole chapter on inclusion of the arts in education in some way, and also the use of Indian languages was some of my inputs, along with Professor Manjul Bhargav, the mathematician. So he and I worked on one chapter together. But that also, I mean, an Indian child would probably not even be able to distinguish between a Tanpura, Veena, Sitar and Sarod, right? I mean, you don't need to be a musician or become a ustad playing some instrument or knowing that there are 8 classical dance forms of India and so on. But at least bare minimum knowledge, the main icons of our arts, domain, who are our cultural ambassadors, so awareness of all of that. So things like this, we had put up some recommendations, which eventually the government, accepted in their final draft of the NEP. Now, of course, implementation, God alone knows by when it will happen. But on the textbooks, sadly, no, I haven't been asked.
Yeah, so good evening, sir. One thing that really left a mark in my mind is, like you said, that let alone the children from foreign countries, even the children from our country are not aware of what all the freedom fighters had to go through. I know because I'm from Rajasthan, so I would say that I know the freedom fighters from my country, but the names that I'm hearing today, since it has not been a long time I've been in Nagpur, so the names that I'm hearing today, I've never heard of those names before. So we have not been even able to cross the boundaries of states, let alone countries. So do you think we would ever be able to get over this? Because as you just mentioned, NEP, which is National Education Policy. So I would love to, and yes, of course, when you said that we just see a picture of Shivaji in the books and nothing else, but yes, we read a lot about Akbar and Jahangir and all these people. So would we ever be able to get over this, and will our children know more about our freedom fighters rather than knowing about the, people who, from other countries who did some good to us? We think that Akbar the Great. But was he actually great, or there were many more great people who were there in our country doing good to our people, and it was not only Akbar who did good to us?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think I would like to be optimistic and hopeful of the future, as much as the present looks very gloomy like the weather outside.
But you also mentioned that this is the reason that we are not progressing anymore,
Yeah,
or maybe
yeah.
not to that pace which
Yeah.
should have been.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So I think the democracy, according to me, is a mechanism of competitive lobbies. Now, because these lobbies, in a good sense, not in any pejorative way, but education, culture, these do not feature probably so high on any government's, and not blaming only this or that government, any government's agenda, because it doesn't feature much in people's agenda. I think once people start putting the pressure on social media, now everybody has the power of this tool of the social media, where you can reach out to the president of the US, to the prime minister of India, to anyone directly by tagging them and saying what you wish to. So if there is a concerted effort by a lot of people saying, we are fed up, we are seeing our children reading this kind of nonsense, and we would like you to make a change. Petitions are signed on that petition.org or whatever that is. And so on all of that, there's no activity on the society also. So to expect also that the governments will do everything and we will just be silent about it. I think
the
that's
observers.
yeah. So somewhere they also feel that they can neglect it because it's not a vote
Someone is going to
catching,
raise
a
the
vote
voice.
gaining,
Yeah.
agenda for them. And secondly, they feel people don't care much, so it's not brought into the mainstream. So I think the minute a lot of people start voicing these opinions, and it's coming up, the consciousness is slowly coming, though very slowly, like everything in India is slow.
Yeah.
So, but then it is coming much better than what it was. To just be aware of the kind of travesties we've done with our past and its narration. But as I said, I would like to remain hopeful for the future,
Very true.
as much as the present doesn't look optimistic at all.
On that note, I would say that you have somehow indirectly told me that, okay, what should be done in order to make people aware that, okay, we should do this much to.
Any more questions? Yeah. Good evening. It was such a pleasure to listen to you speak today. Now, I just have a similar question in line with the same thing. How about children's literature that is being written today? So the kind of literature that my children consume would probably be a lot of Western literature that they're reading. And we do not have any of these stories present for them to imbibe or to read. So are there any authors on the horizon right now who are doing a good job there, or some people that we can look at?
Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any. I think I was still lucky during our time we had this Amar Chitra
Amar Chitra
Katha,
Katha. In
which I
fact,
think,
yeah.
other than our grandmothers who told us stories of Devis and Devtas and
Exactly.
Rajas and Ranis, it was the Amar Chitra Katha which was
So
the...
I think so. Amar Chitra Katha is the fallback again.
But even that has changed, I'm told now.
Yeah.
It's taken a leftward
Yeah,
turn.
so-
So after Uncle Pai's demise. So yeah, there's sadly nobody, and I think the National Book Trust publishes some books for
But
children.
they're not very, they're not very friendly to read, or not very interesting, I would say.
Correct, I know,
Hence.
it's a sad.
Yes.
But the children are not interested in reading those books. They would rather read Goosebumps or Geronimo Stilton or these books. So somehow children are losing interest. In fact, I would say they never had interest in these books. I don't know for what reason, but yes.
But some names that you mentioned do feature in Amar Chitra Katha, like
Yeah.
Ambedkar.
Yes, of course, of
Featured
course.
in Amar
But
Chitra Katha.
only if like children go ahead of
Very
reading those
nicely
books.
said.
Yeah.
They have more copies of the other one.
Exactly.
But like the first one, the first Echoes from the Past does read like a bit like a thriller. So you can get your children to read Secret Societies, and because it's more of the teenage Veer Savarkar. And these are very, please don't get, don't get discouraged looking at the thickness. They are very readable, and we could start them with them. I mean, if you have no choice. And there are other also historians which are making it pretty much readable and easily consumable literature.
I know whom to request for a sales pitch now every time I get a new book done. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Good evening, doctor.
Good evening, sir.
My name is Ajay. So my question is that why Savarkar is hated so much? Is it because of his Putrabhu, Punyabhu ideology? And if another question to it is that if that has taken a definite root into the Indian politics now, the Hindutva ideology has it taken a definitive root in Indian politics?
So yeah, to give a little context on that Pitrubhu, Punyabhu, which maybe some may know, some might not. So, during the time of the First World War, we had this agitation which is very curiously called Khilafat movement. Now, Khilafat, the word, it's a nice word play. We'll think Angrezon ke khilaf kuch kaam kiya to Khilafat. But it was not Khilafat, it was actually the Caliphate, where in Turkey, the British had won Turkey in the First World War, and they wanted to depose the Caliph, and there was an upsurge of people there who did not want him, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk became the ruler of, the leader of Turkey. But then people of India, particularly the Muslim community, was mobilized on this because they considered the Caliph as a holy figure. Gandhiji, in his view that this would be a nice way to promote Hindu-Muslim unity and also bring the Muslims who hitherto were not participating in the freedom movement into the non-cooperation agitation. And so he also promised that within 1 year of his launching of this, he would ensure you can establish a caliphate there and also get Swaraj in India. It was logically, a country which the British have won in war, just because we, a slave nation, some people raise a Kala Jhanda somewhere, they are not going to give up their country and say, okay, Indians are feeling very, very offended, so let's put what they ask for. So it was a logically doomed for failure kind of a movement. And it was communally mobilizing people on religious grounds, which the backlash of that was immense. You had things like when it failed, things like the Mopla carnage in Malabar. We are commemorating 100 years of that now, in 1921, where in broad daylight you had thousands and thousands of Nair men, women and children who were slaughtered by the Moplas in Kerala. And so many riots, communal riots across India in the 1920s. And even during that time, at the height of it, Gandhiji's response, particularly even for the Mopla carnage, he considered them as brave men who were fighting for the cause of their faith. Who were actually killing people in broad daylight. So in such a context, there was a necessity that somebody, posited an intellectual response, an intellectual counter, and that is what Savarkar did. I think the urgency with which it had to be done was why he wrote this little slim volume sitting in the jail in Ratnagiri in 1923, Essentials of Hindutva and Who is a Hindu, where he gave a definition, according to him, this formula, that anybody who lives within the Indus and the ocean, who considers this land as a land of their forefathers, Pitrubhu, and Punyabhu, holy land, not again with the sense of religion, but in terms of their devotion and allegiance and loyalty, that you are not concerned with who is in Turkey and some other place, but you are concerned with the problems of this country. Anybody who considers these two criteria of Punyabhu and Pitrubhu, that person would be culturally and nationally called as a Hindu, according to him. Their faith could be anything. In the precincts of their house, they could be a Muslim or Jew or Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, whatever. But then they would be culturally and nationally called so, was his formulaic definition, which was to some extent also probably problematic for several people at that time, and how he defined this codification, so to say. But then when I also saw that his speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha that he was, and this whole Hindu Rashtra that he conceptualized, time and time again in his speeches there, he says very clearly that the minorities of this country need not even have a ghost of suspicion. That is the phrase, that the legitimate religious, political, cultural, linguistic rights of anyone would be infringed upon in the Hindu Rashtra. The majority will not get any extra privileges only because they are more in number, and the minorities will not get less any more concessions because they are less in number. Everybody is going to be equal in the eyes of the law, and what you follow in your house, that is your personal faith. It should not intrude into the public policy or in government and so on. And what more I don't know is secularism as we define it, where you separate religion and politics in the way it needs to be. So, but then I think today we are able to even understand this. Maybe in his time it was so difficult. As I said, many of his views were so radical and so far-reaching that it was very difficult for people to accept it. And probably that was one reason why he remains, these definitions remain very difficult to be accepted. Maybe he could have been a little more accommodative or explanatory about many things that he very strongly believed in, which he did not, and maybe that's the reason. Yeah. You had something?
The second question I thought that has the politics taken a definite right turn?
The politics?
I mean, the politics around us, has it taken a Hindutva turn?
I'm not so much concerned about the politics because, as I said, that is an it's a sinusoidal wave. Maybe someone who's today above is going to go down tomorrow and who's down today goes up tomorrow. What I'm more happy is that consciousness has come. Like recently we had this terrible conference, masquerading as some scholarly thing. It was a hate-filled conference, dismantling global Hindutva, whatever. And of course, the very poster was so violent with RSS workers being taken away with a hammer and so on. And in academics, can you use a word called dismantling? You can deconstruct. You can understand what it is, but dismantling is, the word comes with a lot of violent connotations with it. So if you want to do dismantling, and that to global, where is Hindutva across the world, which is global? So the agenda of this group was very, very evident. And curiously, the government, the BJP lead, or even the RSS, I think was curiously quite soft about it. They didn't make much of a talk about it. But the outrage about it was by common Indians, common Hindus, both within the country and also in the US. There were so many academics in the US, Hindus, who said, you cannot treat us like this. And they for the longest time kept saying, oh, Hindutva is different from Hinduism and all that. But in the 3 days, by the third day, every speaker was saying, Hindutva cannot exist till there is Hinduism. And Hinduism was apparently the reason for even Nazism. I don't know where that, and no, Brahminism was the reason for Nazism, and all kinds of, it almost started seeming like some parody account, in the way these people, supposed scholars, postulating. The outrage was not led by some party, and thankfully so, but it was led by common people, which maybe 40, 50 years before we would have let this pass, our portrayal this way, or our faith being ridiculed like this globally. Today people are saying, we are not going to take this any further. You better, we will not do the kind of things you do, go and behave violently when you disparage us. But we are going to, in a very peaceful manner, protest. I think millions of letters were written to all those universities who, again, it was a fraud. Most of them did not even say we supported it. Their logos were put there without even their consent. So many of them wrote letters to these to disassociate themselves from this conference and so on. And I'm told now this conference is moving from the US to the UK also. And so it's being done in a very systematic way. One of the most peaceful, non-proselytizing, non-predatory faiths of the world actually being the target of such kind of global tarnishing and agendas. People are waking up to that. So to that extent, if that is called as a right turn or whatever, maybe, may not be, but I would call it as an awakening of consciousness, saying, are we allowing this to happen? Are we going to just remain mute spectators and say, oh, big deal, some conference, how does it matter to us? I think that awareness is more important. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. This is the last question, I think. So I'm going to ask a very simple reader's question, not an intellectual question. First of all, it was a pleasure listening to you. You have a gift of articulation. It was like perfectly worded, every answer that you gave.
I was just going to think you have the gift of the gab. So
No, I'm going to cut it now. So my question is, suppose you, like you mentioned, that documentation and archiving in India is not as good as the Western world. And if you basically are a historian and a writer, so you write about people and personalities. Suppose you get data till 1919, and then suppose you don't get it for next 3 years, and then from 1923 onwards. So as a writer, as a storyteller, do you at times take the liberty of fictionalizing or storytelling, or this could have been, writing a commentary there and leaving it to the reader, or you just skip that part and move on? And second part, if you get a data till like say 1940, and you're not finding anything after that, so will you just stop your research there and not pursue that particular personality?
Wow, this is more intellectual than most of the, this is not a general reader's question at all. Thank you for that. No, I think, no, Indians not being good at documentation, I wouldn't say that completely. I think that's again, I don't know if I said that inadvertently, it probably is wrong. We document in our way, in our own way. I think everything about India is so unique that, we have documented, we have written the maximum number of manuscripts which are existing. Our history is not the way the Greeks wrote history, like how Herodotus and others conceptualized history. Our history in the Itihasa, the Puranas or the epics that is there, part story, part facts. So it's left to the capability of the researcher to extract information out of it. Like for instance, even, we say the Pythagoras theorem came from the Sulba Sutras and so on. So in the Sulba Sutras, if you go and see it, it's not going to say clearly a square equal to b square plus c square, that sort of a, formula. It will be in poetry. It's a long poem. So what is called Vedic mathematics, those are also all poetry form. So from that, what do you extract out of it to make sense? So we have a very unique approach and perspective to life. So, and the fact that we are not trained in our own languages, the fact that we are looking even to our past only through the prism of English or translations, which are in itself so, erroneous. Vedic Sanskrit, if someone has to understand where every word can have 10 meanings, you need a Vedic scholar to sit and deconstruct each word and in what context what word is used and so on. So, but we are relying on some Max Muller or some German or some other Indologist who would not understand the concept, and based on that we make our assumptions. And also this thing. Now, on the walls of the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, almost there are 600 names of the Devdasis who performed in the king's court and in the temple, with their names and addresses and how much salary they got, and all of that carved on the temple walls. So how can we say Indians were bad at documentation? But it's just that we didn't probably bring out a book like the way the Romans or the Greeks or anybody did. Our history lives on our temple walls. It lives on our in our manuscripts. It lives in through epigraphic, numismatic evidences. So all of that need to be put together to make a holistic picture. And the sad part is, I think, centuries of invasions and plunder, most of it has also been destroyed. Like most of our centers of learning, whether it was Vikramshila, Nalanda, Takshashila, all these universities were burned down. So a lot of our knowledge of that time also has gone away. So these are some of the handicaps that a researcher of the past, our inability to understand the language, whether it is Sanskrit or Persian or Tamil or whatever classical languages, to deconstruct those eras, that is also a major handicap. But when things are not available, as you said, I'm facing that currently in my new book, where, as I said, all these 18 stories. There's this lady, this Nike Devi I mentioned. There is just 3 lines about her in some Pali text, in Gujarat, where it says that even a woman could actually defeat this Hammira, the Amir, the Indian, this thing was a Hammira. So Muhammad Ghori was called that. So even a woman, so disparagingly said he was such a coward that even a woman could destroy him, and he never turned his back again to Gujarat. That's all that she features in, in documented text. But there is a lot of folklore, oral stories. You have this Rani Ki Vav there in Gujarat, where in Patan, you go down those step wells. That's not of Nike Devi, but one of her predecessor queens. But then through that, there are some local stories of what they remember of this. So some things, after centuries too, in some curious way, I think we're such an oral tradition, right? Everything passes on word of mouth. The Vedas, etc., were hardly codified, written down and kept anywhere. It passed on word of mouth through generations. So when deconstructing Indian history, we cannot neglect the importance of folklore, oral history, and these other kind of evidences we put. We cannot rely only on the written word as the gospel truth, and which is again a unique perspective of how we need to write our past. Even as a student of music, now I think there are these Skype lessons and all that happen for music. But as a student myself, I was not allowed to write down the music I learned. You had to repeat it several times and internalize that music. Only then it becomes a part of you, and not if you're reading out. So our music is never conducted music. It is something that is improvisatory that comes from within you. So I think that importance is there in all disciplines, whether it is our way of worship, or our way of documentation, or the way of telling our own story of the past. The Mahabharata, for instance, gives a beautiful political geography of all the dynasties of India at that time, if someone actually plots it that way. When we see Rama's whole pilgrimage, his whole tour across India from Ayodhya to Lanka, and the places he stopped at and so on, that kind of gives you an indication as to who ruled then, what was this thing. But part myth, part this thing, it's not going to be as it is you expect documentation to be. So how to sieve through that and make sense and not appear like mumbo jumbo, I think that is the challenge that a historian and a storyteller would face.
Hello, just a question. What Savarkar was relevant till 1948, but from 48 to 62 we don't hear much about him. Yeah. Can you just tell us about it?
So I think especially after his implication in Gandhi's murder, and though he was honorably exonerated from the courts, the constant witch hunt that continued against him, surveillance, ensured that he had probably got disillusioned with life in general, was a very broken man, at least towards the end of his life. In fact, he didn't even end, it was not a natural death. He took away his life, so to say, in that Atmahuti, the Jain tradition of Paryopaveshan, right? So where you give up your the food and water and So, but then, in fact, in 1950, when the Nehru-Liaquat Ali Pact was being signed, there's very draconian, this one was imposed, where anybody who's speaking about a foreign nation or its dismemberment would be accused of being anti-national and put in jail. So anybody who was saying that we need Akhand Bharat and that Pakistan needs to be a part of India would actually be considered a traitor, because you are being inimical to a foreign nation and therefore a threat to this nation. And so under that provision, Preventive Detention Act, Savarkar and almost all the people of the Hindu Mahasabha were put under in jail for several months, and they had to give an undertaking that we will not talk about politics till the time of the first general election. Now you can imagine 1951 general election, the only opposition party was the Mahasabha. All its leaders are in jail, and they are not allowed to make political speeches. And the party, which is the main party, is going around town saying this is the party which has caused the Mahatma's murder and all of that. So obviously they come to power also and then systematically annihilate the opposition. There's no space for a political opposition at all. And at that time, when Shama Prasad Mukherjee formed the Jan Sangh, and then mysterious circumstances, he dies in Kashmir, in Nazarbandi, and all of this. So, but then when these restrictions were removed on Savarkar, he wrote copiously, warning Nehru's government about many things, particularly on national security and so on, which we again sadly did not, follow. Like for instance, he warned all the time that we should be wary of China and that there should be cautious optimism. Those were his words, cautious optimism of this Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai and Panchsheel and all these lofty principles, and everybody scoffed at him. But 10 years later, 1962 proved that what he was prophesizing was very true. He had this amazing gift, I think, because of the amount he read of world literature and global geopolitics. He could probably predict what is going to come in the future. Like in 1929 itself, 10 years before the Second World War, he writes 4 articles, and I quote that in this book also, predicting that there will be a global conflict again in the world. In 1929, there was actually nothing. It was all calm and peaceful. He said there's going to be another one, just like we had the First World War. And this time, India should make use of the calamity which is going to befall our colonial masters. When your master is weak and embroiled in war, you please up the ante and don't let this opportunity go to win freedom, otherwise you'll never be able to do again. So this ability to prophesize and predict, so including, he wrote, especially after independence, the changed demographics in the Northeast and how that is going to be a huge deterrent to national security and so on. So we're seeing insurgent movements in the northeast, Nagaland, and all of that we see. So most of these things, and the only person who probably stood in support of Israel and its creation in 1948, when India took a very ambivalent position whether we want to support, and a country like Israel, which is so friendly to India, and we have so many reasons to collaborate on anti-terror, on technology, startups, and agriculture, so many things. So we made willfully and unnecessarily, bad enemies with them, or not great friends. So all of these he did right, and this thing, but nobody was listening. And I think the taint of that murder was emphasized so much that he was such a persona non grata in politics and in public discourse. Like I always keep stating that so many times, the manner in which even Pandit Hridaynath Mangeshkar, lost his job in the All India Radio just for tuning his poem Ne Majasine Parat Matra Bhumila Sagara Pran Tadmadala. So that poem being tuned cost Hridaynath Mangeshkar ji a job. So in such a case, who would want to be associated with someone, by long association you lose your livelihood and so on. So that's one reason he almost faded away into oblivion, and probably was a very broken man towards the end of his life, which is why he said, the run that I have for my motherland, I have fulfilled it, and so I need to go now.
So much. I think this has been one of our longest sessions and the most eye-catching. Oh my God. So thank you so much, everybody. And I would like to request Mr. Sanket Athavale, Front Office Manager of Radisson Blu, to please come here and give Sir the memento of gratitude for being present with us. If I start the list of being grateful to, it'll really take us too long. But definitely our associate partners, our venue partner, Radisson Blu, our media partners, Me Lokmat, Shri Cement, Ehsaas Women of Nagpur, and Prabha Ketan Foundation in itself for creating such brilliant events. And last but not least, the audience who has been so gracefully be patient and curious all throughout. And thank you, Mr. Vikram Sampath. You have really made this event so eye-catching that no one wants to leave their seats anymore. Definitely, and everybody who has registered, please come forward after we are done with this and get your signed copy of the book. Each family will receive one book copy, and hope you love reading it. Thank you.